So I'm going to start off with a question, and there'll be like 2 questions, and then you can just sit there in silence and look at me. So first, who here likes sports? Okay, that's pretty good for a web development conference. Sure. And the second question is, who here works in a team? That's, again, most of you. So as developers, we kind of have this thing in common with sports, that a lot of us can actually work in teams, and sports involve teams as well. So for the next kind of 45 minutes or so, I want to take what we can learn from these sporting teams and bring them into our kind of development practices. So because teams are important, this is a fairly famous quote from football manager Jose Mourinho, sorry. And I did forget a warning quickly that there's quite a few GIFs in this talk, so if you have any motion sickness or things you might need to look away at various times, first time is now. So that's Jose Mourinho. Happy chappy. And he says players don't win you trophies, teams win you trophies. And considering that Chelsea are current Premier League title holders, then I guess we can consider him a fairly reputable source. In terms of myself, I've been a developer for just over 6 years now. I've always worked in kind of small to medium-sized agencies, teams of around 3 to 20 developers. And the main thing that they've had in common is that they're always growing teams. So we've always been expanding or bringing on new team members. And so today I want to kind of talk about what I've learned in that time and the things that have kind of helped us along the way. My current team is at a company called DXW, where we work, where I'm a developer and designer, and we work specifically there for the public sector, which is like the UK government sort of thing. If you've ever heard of the government digital service in the UK, that's pretty much similar to what we do, but we're just a small agency version of them. So first I want to take a look at some aspects of sporting teams that may help us to, the aspects of sporting teams that help to make them good teams. And the first thing I noticed was planning. A lot of great teams have certain strategies and plans for each game, but none quite so prevalent as in American football. In American football, they have the play, and according to Wikipedia, a play is a close-to-the-ground plan of action or strategy used to move the ball down the field, which looks like this. That's good, apparently. Next up, there's teamwork. Every person in a team mucking in and doing their part. And this is extremely obvious when it comes to the rolling maul in rugby. The entire forward line here works together in this huge group, driving the team forward and the others back. They have to work together to go forward, and there's no individuals at this point. It's about the team scoring a try, not the person at the not the person who actually eventually puts the ball down. So following on from this, something else that comes to mind when watching certain teams is that everyone here makes an equal contribution. Even at times, some of the more junior members will be making more of a valuable contribution to the team than the more experienced members. And this is best exemplified in cycling teams. More so maybe in time trials than in regular GC riding. Each team member will do their stint on the front to help the rest of the team. In general classification riding, things like the Tour de France or the La Vuelta, it'll often be some of the more junior members of the team riding in a role called the domestique, doing most of the work to get their leader to the top. Next up is adaptability. Those on a great team always show the ability to adapt to their situation, being able to take on other people's roles when necessary in order to give the team the greatest advantage. You can see examples of this sort of adaptability in the 1970s Dutch football tactic known as total football. Each member of the team was aware and able to fill in for any other member of the team when needed. They had their more favoured positions, of course, which matched their specific skill set. But when the team required, they could easily switch around roles to give the best advantage. This tactic won Ajax the European Cup on 3 occasions in the 1970s and 4 titles, including the National League in 1972. And finally, all teams need to have good communication skills. When I started thinking about communication, the relationship between a rally driver and their co-driver seemed to me like a great example. Due to the sheer speed and technicality of the courses, the driver and co-driver need to have this consistent language and consistent way of communication, as well as the trust in each other. And this is where the co-driver's pace notes or course notes come into play. These series of notes written in a specific and consistent language are things that both the driver and co-driver can understand and allows them to communicate more effectively during the tough conditions of a rally course. So you can clearly see that all of these sporting teams show various aspects of what makes up a great team in general. What I want to do now is take you through some of my experiences working with development teams and show you how these aspects can apply to the teams that we work in. And while doing so, I'm also going to take a look at what went wrong along the way and what could have been done better and what I've actually learned in those situations. So it's not all serious. So to start with, I want to look at baselines. For me, teams work better when they're all working from a consistent baseline. Having that baseline means projects stick to a similar pattern and can be predictable. If everyone knows the plan, anyone can pick up a project with little or no handover or explanation of what needs to go where. At one of my previous companies, Architect, this kind of boilerplate idea manifested itself as or this baseline manifested itself as a boilerplate for our front-end projects. It was a complete set of base files and a folder structure to start all of our front-end projects, which meant we were consistent across the way. We had an assets folder that included all of our source files and pre-processed images. There's a large SAS structure in there too, which came with some helpful tools that we could use across all projects, including things like a grid, some media query mix-ins, and some extra color functions, just simple things like that that we always generally use. There was also a default gulp file. Your task runner may vary, it's all the same. It had a bunch of tasks in, like compiling SAS, JavaScript, minification, things like that. It wasn't kind of perfect, it didn't fit every single project, but it gave us a baseline that we knew kind of the base things would be done. We have had a lot of discussion actually over whether to include this in the first place, but we decided actually instead of having everybody have their own specific ideas of how to run tasks on each project, we should be able to get a project and know exactly whether to run gulp, grunt, or make, or whatever to get a project started. So we chose we did a little survey and we chose gulp. One thing we also started on was the beginnings of a SAS pattern library. And in this context, it was kind of like a set of code partials that would be used across a lot of projects, kind of a starting point for certain functionality. We'd generally be building things like banners and blocks and things like that, things that we could just drop into any project. And we were looking at basing this roughly around Brad Frost's atomic design principles, thinking more around the scale of atoms and molecules at the absolute highest point. You know, not doing something more akin to Bootstrap, which has a lot of design decisions already made for you. It was still a work in progress when I left, but it's something I'd be interested in picking up on again. I know I've talked to a few friends who are looking at doing something similar. In a similar vein, there is a company in London called Made by Many, and they put together their own CSS patterns library, which is also on GitHub. And I'd kind of recommend checking it out. It was an interesting way of just having certain consistent base things to do. At DXW, at the moment, we have a base theme template for work, because a lot of the work we do is in WordPress. And it's part of our WordPress management product we call Whippet, which allows us to install a base theme generated with a set of conventions, again, like folder structure and base things we always do in WordPress. So everything is kind of similar. And At the moment, it includes a default grunt file and some front-end options, but it's not quite as comprehensive as the one we had at Architect. So my Christmas task, I guess, is to kind of amalgamate the two and kind of create something that will be a really good base for both WordPress and front-end projects. So, following on from this idea of baselines within the development team, I think it's really important to kind of take that on and make sure that code stays consistent throughout your projects. So we have our starting point, the boilerplate. It's a great place to make sure that the structure looks the same. But when you drill into the project code itself, the team should be striving to keep that consistency. Mark Otto says it best: code should look as if it's been written by one person. Even if the code has come from a group of developers, it should look and feel the same and overall be consistent. And this is where coding style guides come in, the obligatory XKCD slide. Not only are they important when working in a team, but they're important when working on your own code too, as you can see from the comic. As Harry Roberts puts it in the introduction to his CSS guidelines, a coding style guide is a valuable tool for teams who build and maintain products for a reasonable length of time, have developers of different abilities and specialisms, have a number of different developers working on the product at any given time, and have a number of code bases that developers dip in and out of. Now, this has certainly been true for a number of development teams that I've worked in. We've often had a variety of different projects that we've been working on and would jump between, depending on who was available at certain times. I've worked with a few really long-running projects, which would have varying numbers of developers working on at the same time or at different times. And the teams I've worked with has been made up of developers with varying skill levels. So this idea of a style guide was really important to keep our code consistent across the entire team and across projects at any given time as well. There's a variety of code style guides available, from Mark Otto's code guide himself to Hugo Girardel's SAS guidelines. And actually there was so many that I decided to put together a repo of my own to collate all of the code style guides. So if there's any other code style guides you know of or want to contribute your own, please do send me a PR. I'd love to add it there and keep this collection growing. But as Mark says, it's not about which guidelines are correct. This is not just about making sure that everybody codes to the way they want to. If you was in James Higgs' keynote this morning, you'll have heard him talking about developers who change the code to make it look the best way for them every time. And that's just a waste. You need to code to a consistent set of guidelines, whether you believe they're correct or not. The team should agree. So this brings me back around to another sport, cycling. And I'm a fairly regular cyclist, not so much past couple of months, but this is a photo from the Ride London event that happened last year. It's a yearly event that takes in the Olympic cycling route since 2012. And it's a 100-mile ride around London and Surrey. And this was the conditions last year when I did it. And I did it again this year. Luckily, we had a lot better weather. So if you're a cyclist too, you may have heard of the Voluminati, which is a very strange thing to say, and something that they call the rules. It's kind of like a cycling etiquette. I think it's tongue-in-cheek. I really hope it's tongue-in-cheek because it's quite harsh. So at Architect, my previous company, we decided to create the rules for coding etiquette. And this was our code style guide. It was a play on the Voluminati rules and of the same name, and because we took the same play on that, we took some of the titles and twisted the kind of rules to fit our meaning as well. And I just want to go through a couple of the rules we had to give you an idea about what things we were trying to achieve. So the first rule sounds quite harsh, but I kind of wrote the description with it to be a bit more fluffy and kind of give a bit of wiggle room. It's not meant to be that kind of harsh. This was probably the most important rule that we needed to be aware of. None of this is personal to anyone. Code guidelines are there to keep the team consistent and make sure we're all on the same page, not to point out your particular inconsistencies in code. It's there about keeping code consistent. And the rules weren't just there to prosecute either. They were about encouraging the team to do more, to be kind of interested in what they do still. And I can't talk about rules without mentioning these. I love to share these. This is Chuck Jones's rules for the Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner cartoons. I don't know if they made it to Italy, but hoping a few made it across. And these rules made sure the cartoons stayed consistent no matter who was drawing them. And I especially love Rule 8. If anybody's watched the cartoon or heard of the cartoon, you'll know that the coyote was always being defeated by gravity, always falling down. It was fantastic. However, there were some things that didn't quite go to plan. But I'm hoping that by sharing, it gets better the more you watch it, this one, I love it. I'm hoping that by sharing some of what went wrong, others can learn from it and maybe avoid doing these things in the future. So despite the idea that this was going to be a fun take, I say fun in inverted commas, it was meant to be a take on the Voluminati rules. I don't think the idea of rules kind of went down well with everybody. Some people got the joke, but others really didn't get the joke. And when you kind of have to explain a joke, it's not very funny anymore. So in future, I'm going to avoid making them feel like rules and making them feel more like kind of guidelines and more etiquette sort of things, and make it sound like we're doing these things for the right reasons, not just being told that these are rules and we have to stay tied to them. When talking about coding styles at DXW, we came across this from ThoughtBot's playbook. And these are the really high-level guidelines for their code style. And I think these are great, and probably something we'll probably steal when we get to create our playbook and developer guidelines at DXW. Certainly something we've been talking about a lot lately. So once you have some sort of style guide, you're going to need a way to enforce them. And this is making sure people stick to them in a given project, because it's one thing having a set of guidelines or etiquette, but it's another thing making sure people stay to develop consistently. And there are two ways I want to talk about how to enforce these rules. And the first one is doing auto-enforceable rules. So these can be taken care of by various... okay. I always just freeze when that happens. So you can take care of this with various linting tools, things like JSHint or JSLint. There's also SassLint, which is now in JavaScript as well as Ruby, which is great because you don't need any more Ruby dependencies if you're using libsass. And linters allow you to set certain rules for your code that align with your style guide, so that you can run this before every commit or before every push and make sure that the code is sticking to the code style guide. The other method I want to kind of go into a bit more detail about is code reviews. Now, code reviews are manual checks and evaluation of your code performed by another member of the development team. And this process means you get a second eye on your code, and it can be done by anyone in the team, senior or junior. And actually, I found doing a code review on my own code quickly is really helpful, just to make sure you look at it in a different way and remove yourself from the development of it. So you'll also find a lot of the time that even though a senior developer may be able to spot potential problems in a project, junior developers are just as capable and may even be better placed to suggest where something could be done better or kind of more obvious. I know after having my code reviewed by a lot of junior members of the development team at Architect, I found myself going back over code and redoing certain areas to make improvements and refactor some code that made it a lot easier to understand. However, this is where we made another mistake at first. So when we tried to initiate code reviews back at Architect, the aim was to have at least one senior developer lead a project and code review each bit of code that went through it. And senior developers who were working on their own project would get another senior developer to help lead that project as well. But by doing this, we ran into problems with senior developers not having enough time to review projects because we put all of the pressure on them to do this. And then also, it made junior members feel like they were being tested in some way, being that they weren't good enough to do these code reviews, so their code was then up for scrutiny. It wasn't the idea at all. We just tried to create a way to make this happen. We tried to put the responsibility on senior developers to make it happen, but it kind of failed. So one thing, while kind of making junior developers, they may not be the best equipped to do code reviews and review more complex code, there is massive value to be found in allowing new developers to read code. And there's a great talk that talks about this kind of new developers learning how to code by reading code and reading pull requests. And that's by Saran Yitbarek from last year's Rails Conf. I definitely recommend checking it out. And it's not just about the reading of the code, it's about the discussion around that code as well. And this is where the best learning kind of happens. Being able to talk through the code, what it's doing, what you think's good, what's bad, having your questions answered. I know this is something we do a lot now at DXW. We've brought in code reviews, and anytime the junior developer I'm working with I ask her to review all of my code, and if she comes back, I want her to discuss it. I want her to ask questions, why it's doing certain things. And we have pointed out issues in both of our codes. And I've gone back and written quite a bit. And this also applies to discussion that happens before you even start writing code. We know that code is going to be pull requested and code reviewed. So at the start of a day, we now work in small teams at DXW. So at the start of a day or at the start of a story, we'll put aside a little bit of time, maybe 10, 15 minutes, to sit and discuss the upcoming bit of work. To sit there and talk about what needs to happen, how we could possibly solve this, and things like that, so that when we get through to actually doing the pull request, there's no surprises. We know where this is coming from. We know what kind of idea and plan the developer had at the start of the day. So again, I've mentioned this a couple of times, but at both Architect and DXW, we did code reviews via pull request. So we always use Git for source control and Bitbucket or GitHub for managing the code. And these platforms are a great way to do visual pull requests. And actually, we instated GitHub processes at DXW because of code reviews. So doing code reviews in a pull request is fantastic. It means you can kind of see all the changes that have been done. We can get descriptions from the developer about why certain changes have been made. And then we can discuss the PR in line with the code. We can comment directly on a bit of code that needs either further explanation, could have been done better, or breaks the rules of a style guide. What we also aimed to do back when we had the rules-based style guide was be able to quickly link to these specific rules and tell a developer, by the way, your code is breaking this rule, and here's the description and explanation why that's bad or why that could be improved. And when doing code reviews, it really has to be nothing personal. It really has to be all about the code. It's about making sure that there's consistency, keeping code adherent to the code style, and making sure that everybody's working better as this team. But again, when we first started doing this, we ran into a couple of issues. Because there's simple mistakes that you can make when you do things for the first time, and this kind of simple mistake had a kind of unintended side effect. When I was reviewing pull requests, I would comment on the areas that I thought needed improving, even small areas, and then I'd actually reject the PR. And that actually doesn't sound like a big deal, but by rejecting the PR, you're turning around to someone and saying, oh, no, this is not good enough. Go away, do it again. Instead, the alternative that's much better is just to comment on the code, explain what needs updating, allow the developer to then update that code and push again, and that will just update the PR. Maybe this was me just getting used to doing pull requests and working with GitHub for the first few times, but we actually discussed around this sort of thing, and it made a real difference, just being able to comment and have that discussion as the code kept updating, and it's brilliant that you can do this in GitHub. So by using this consistent baseline, ensuring we have the code style guide and a practice of code reviewing, we get to ensure that our code is consistent, that it's easier for developers to switch in and out of projects, and it also makes it easier for new developers to come on board and join the team. And something else that makes all these things a lot easier is also documentation. So particularly when working with growing teams, and especially that when you're hiring more staff in, you need to be able to keep the team consistent and have everyone on the same page from day one, there needs to be good documentation in order to do this. At DXW, we've recently been working on what this means, and we've come up with kind of two classifications for documentation, general documentation and contextual. So general is kind of things that apply company-wide or team-wide. Things like a password policy, health and safety information, and the coding style guide would fit into these kind of more general documentation classifications. Ideally, this should be kept in a single location, so it's easily accessed and searchable. Not some parts in a wiki, others in a Google Doc. One central location that everybody knows and everybody has access to. This is something we've been working on. It's now on our GitHub. It's called the Playbook. So if you go to GitHub DXW Playbook, you'll see it's a work in progress, a big document where we keep literally every bit of general documentation that we have or need. Contextual documentation should be more on a per project basis, and I guess this applies more to developers. It's contained within a project's README, or for instance, in the direct comments in the code even. Contextual documentation could include things like how to get set up on a particular project, anything to be aware of when working with it, if there's a different stack to the one we normally use, if things were trialed out, stuff like that. So good documentation is vital for for current members of staff to allow them to refer to it, and allowing that in a central location allows you to quickly check for a particular part of the style guide, or just allow developers to be able to quickly find whether they need to run grunt or gulp on this project. Sorry, that's for contextual. But it's also vital for onboarding new developers as well. One of the first issues I had when joining DXW was that there was a real lack of documentation, both in general and contextual. It left me pretty sad in terms of the process. I had to assume code style from current projects. I had to switch my code style out, but there was nowhere to tell me that we use two space tabs across all projects. It was just, I had to flick through about 10 different files to go, okay, this seems pretty consistent, so I'm going to guess that that's our code style. And you know, I had to go searching through projects to find out whether there was grunt or gulp. And when it's hidden and in an obfuscated folder, then you know it's harder. It makes it harder for a developer to find out new things. So among one of the many things I'm working on at DXW at the moment is how to improve our overall documentation and get it all into an order where we can get better onboarding and give our new developers a better onboarding experience. We're looking at hiring new developers, so this is our thing. If you're working in London, want to come and work in London, please give me a shout. We're hiring Rails developers. And we want to give them a good experience, and a much better experience than I had in my first few weeks. Because when you join a new company, it can be kind of alienating. You can feel like you're a bit on your own at times. So it takes a bit of effort from some of the more established members of the team to make you feel part of that new team. So on to the final subject, teamwork. As a dev team, it's not just about the code. It's actually about how you work together as a unit and how you can help each other out when someone's stuck, or how you can learn together, and how you get to grow as a team. An architect, we had around 20 developers in total, but we also had smaller teams within this group. At a base level, we were split into 4 areas, back-end developers, front-end developers, SharePoint developers, and then the directors. And from there, each team was split up into teams of 3. Each team had a senior developer and a mid-junior weight developer. This way of splitting up into smaller teams kind of allowed for a few things. Firstly, there was mentorship. And by splitting into smaller teams, it meant the senior developer became the line managers for the other 2. This means that they had a direct person they could turn to if they needed development help, or if they needed to talk about personal development within the company. And it kind of worked both ways as well. I was a line manager, but I'd often first reach out to someone in my team if I was having a problem, or talk to them through a coding issue before I went to kind of other developers in the company. And the second part, it kind of gave us responsibility. By making the teams a lot smaller, it made people feel more responsible for what they were doing, because we were working more closely with our other teammates, rather than just being another cog in this big development machine. We had someone kind of talking to each other all the time about their work every day, about discussing what they were going to do, where things were going well, where things went wrong. And for me, it felt like a sense of responsibility for their work and for their kind of growth within the company. I was there to help kind of mentor them, and I felt kind of responsible for whether they did a good job or not. At DXW, we've set up a what we're calling a buddy system for all members of staff. While we're free to kind of choose any member of the company to be our buddy, as it were, I've been asked to buddy with one of the more junior developers. This is allowing us to meet kind of on regular occasions, talk about her career, her development, what she thinks she's doing well at, and what things need to be looked into a bit more. And I think it really gave her a bit of kind of a feeling of someone's there looking after her, or not even looking after her, more someone's there to discuss things with her and give her kind of some feedback as to whether she's doing well or not. It's kind of early days, but we've had a couple of chats and they've gone pretty well so far, and it's different. It's nice to take that conversation out of just on a project basis, on a day-to-day working basis. So back to the wider team in general, I think it's extremely beneficial to kind of learn together as a team as well. This industry moves at such a pace, it's really hard to keep up at times. And while keeping up with things goings on in web development is hard on your own, when you're in a development team, learning together is going to be vital. And as a team, sharing knowledge is extremely valuable. And while there were a variety of different skill sets and development positions within the dev team back at Architect, we had back-end developers, front-end developers, and SharePoint developers all kind of working on the same thing. We found it really important to discuss things as a team in general. It allowed us to understand each other's roles and what might be going on in different world of development than what we're used to. So at Architect, we did this through something called the Developer Déjeuner. It was so named because it was conceived when Architect had a couple of French developers on the team, and despite the fact that they left, I think before I joined, which was over 2 years ago, the name kind of carried on. It was quite cool. So the déjeuner was a kind of group lunch for all developers. The company would buy us lunch, and we'd kind of have a chance to get together and discuss things. Someone would do a talk, or we'd either have one or two talks, and then we could, everybody was encouraged to discuss or bring a talk to this at some point. And I think these were extremely valuable over the time I've been at Architect, because I got introduced to so many different new things and ways of thinking about my my code. It was great for building up knowledge and awareness of other things that people were working on. And another thing we used to do as a group was probably a lot less frequently, mainly because they didn't provide lunch for these, were these group code reviews. We used to do code reviews on projects in general, but at times we'd get together and someone would volunteer their code to be reviewed in the session. And it was a great way to take a look at someone's code and discuss what's good and bad and what could be reviewed. I volunteered for this a couple of times, and it's ridiculously scary to sit there and have your code, the things you write, up on a board in front of everyone. But to have it scrutinized in such a public manner is really beneficial. I learned a lot about what others found confusing about the code I'd written, and because I worked across a lot of disciplines, I found out that I was quite weak in terms of more modern PHP techniques, and a lot of people were able to turn around and say, oh, there's better ways of doing this now. You don't have to stick with the WordPress way. So, oh, okay. Just a quick note on this. We didn't have to do this very often, but there were a few rules around this group code review process. And we had a carding system. So if you said things like WordPress sucks, a random comment, you'd get a yellow card. And if you got enough, you'd eventually get a red card and be told to sit in the corner, still attend, but sit in the corner and be quiet. But most of the time, people were good. We had a referee, Sam. She used to get the card out every now and again, but not very often. And this was there mainly because it needs to be a constructive atmosphere. This shouldn't be about criticism. It shouldn't be about saying that the things you're doing are crap. It should be about saying, oh, this could probably be done a bit better. Have you thought about this? not don't do it like that. And my last very kind of brief point I want to make is about conferences like this. I think they're extremely important, and I've really liked being able to attend with members of my team and co-workers over the years, and I also think it's valuable for people to attend on their own too. It's great if you can attend the conference as a team. Even if you can go as just a single member, it's really important that when you do go, you come back and share what you've learned with the rest of the team. I actually encourage devs to be more active in attending meetups and conferences at Architect, and a few people were going, and we actually eventually got given a conference budget back at Architect before I left. But, I mean, it's a great thing to be able to do, to go and see these conferences, but you've got to take this knowledge back when you're working in a team and share it with people, even if it's a short post, or maybe get together, have lunch, and go over what you've learned, what kind of things you'd like to explore further. Nobody can take back hard evidence from or hard conclusions from a conference. It's generally just things that you want to go away and try again and try something new. Maybe you do want to go back now and try a code style. It's like, okay, let's bring it up, let's discuss it. So one thing I've learned over the last few years of working in these kind of small, growing teams of developers is that everyone has their own specialities and their own nuance to the way they approach problem solving or the way they write code. So can we build great dev teams with learnings from some of the great sporting teams? I think we kind of can. So great teams plan well to be able to succeed. By planning your development work with boilerplates and potentially a pattern library, it means everyone has a consistent starting point to work from. Code style guides can then help to continue that consistency through to the code the team writes, allowing developers to switch between projects more easily and to come into projects when they're needed. Teams must work together in a dev team as well. With the team all on the same page, it gives people the feeling of responsibility, brings the team closer together, and encourages a better working environment. Good development teams know that they can learn from each other and make use of everyone's own skill set and experience. Everyone on the team must be equal and treated as such. Junior and senior developers can both offer equal amounts of skill and experience. We're working in the web, so there's so much to learn nowadays that everyone has to be treated as equal. I have no doubt someone will have experience of something you don't, no matter how long they've been coding. Everyone on the team should be adaptable. I think it's important for all developers to understand the roles of their colleagues. Getting together, sharing knowledge from different disciplines gives everyone a better understanding of what everyone in the team does and can offer to the team. And finally, there's communication. Having a consistent and easily accessible documentation for your team is vital. Knowing what code style you should be following or how you're meant to build a certain project is going to make sharing projects across your team a much smoother experience and will help bring new team members on board a lot more easily. Ultimately, it is hard work though. Teams work better together when they're a cohesive unit. There's no room for egos and edge cases. Each developer needs to work with the team to create great work. If you have someone pushing back against the progress of the rest of the team, it's not going to work as well. Just like in a scrum in rugby, everyone has to be moving forward in the same direction to succeed. So thank you. My slides are already up on SlideShare, which I think I've used because they support Creative Commons. So please do go and check them out. I've also handed them over to Codemotion. And yeah, if you have any questions, feel free. Yeah.
So, code review, do you deliver them just in written form, or you try to box or face-to-face?
So it varies. Most of the time we use GitHub and just comment directly in the pull request, but we have those comments coming into our Slack, so we kind of see when someone's commented on our PR. So, and I'm sat literally there to the other developer who's code reviewing. So if we kind of think there's something more to discuss, I just look up and go, hi, can we chat? And we'll chat face to face. One thing I didn't actually mention today was pair programming. We do a heck of a lot of it now at DXW. And so we'll sit next to each other and code for an afternoon and just work on a problem together and stuff. So that's really valuable. And yeah, discussing it in person is good at times when it's needed that more kind of deeper understanding. But I think comments for quick things in tasks are really useful. Just to kind of go, oh, by the way, why is this here? Or what does this do? But yeah, it's cool. Anybody else? I realize I've finished quite early, so you've got like 20 minutes before the next talk. So, I mean, if you want to go and check out the sponsors, it'd be great. If you have any other questions, feel free to come and chat to me. I'm going to be around for the next couple of days as well. Hopefully see you guys for a beer later.